Hi everyone, thanks for watching our webinar. This is our PestFacts webinar for the Southern region, and it's brought to you by SARDI, CSER and QDAF today. Our organisations are part of the National IPM for Grains project. That's a GRDC investment and it has in-kind support from the project partners. We have a very large number of viewers today, so what we'll be doing is taking all questions via the Q&A box, so have a look for that box on your screens and put any questions that you have throughout the webinar in there. We'll answer the questions in the box throughout the webinar, so keep an eye out for those answers as well. Today, we will start with a regional pest report update by Julia Severi from CSER. Then we'll move on to an update on Russian wheat aphid research from Aaliyah Pertul from CSER and Martin van Helden from SARDI. And we'll finish with information about fall armyworm presented today by Melina Miles from QDAF. So let's get into it. I'm going to hand right over to Julia Severi for the first talk.
Thanks, Jess. Hopefully you can all hear me okay, but just let me know if you can't. So today I'm going to talk about weed web moth because it has been probably the pest that's been most topical for the past about a month now in southern and central New South Wales. So the weed web moth is a cotton web spinner, that's its other name, and it is a native species here in Australia, and it is considered an irregular pest, and as a native species that doesn't occur too often in broadacre crops and pastures, there's not really a whole lot known about it. But one thing that does come up in the literature is that it is thought to migrate long distances, which is why we're seeing it appear in large numbers quite suddenly. As you can see here in this image, this was recently taken about a month ago in some grazing canola. You can see the numbers of the larvae are quite high. So as I mentioned, it has been a problem in central and southern New South Wales recently. This has been in predominantly early sown canola and also lucerne. But now there's also evidence that it is starting to pop up in Victoria and South Australia. We've had quite a few moth sightings, and now there is also evidence, the first sort of reports popping up in Victoria, of the larvae, sorry, in Victoria and South Australia. As I mentioned before, there's not a lot known about this pest, a native species. The research just has not gone into it. So we don't really know a whole lot about its biology, but all signs are pointing at that it could decline with winter weather. But looking back on PestFacts reports, we have seen this is a species that over the years has been reported into June. So really the key message is keep an eye out on establishing crops in the southeastern and southern region at the moment and throughout the rest of autumn and into early winter. So this is what the moth looks like. It's not a large moth at all. It's only about 2 centimetres in wingspan. So I say it's around the size of a thumbnail. And when its wings are swept back, it forms like a bit of a triangle like that. And quite often this is what its wing patterns look like. It's sort of like this pale creamy colour, yellowy colour also. And it often has these brown this brown coloration with these orangey sort of red flecks throughout it. But I should also point out, it doesn't always have this pattern. It can look quite homogeneous in colour as well. So that's something just to be mindful of. This is what the larvae look like, and quite often you might see their webs or their damage before the larvae themselves. It's not a large caterpillar at all. It only grows to around 2 centimetres, and they're quite slender in their appearance. Colour is greyish green, and one thing that you will notice is they're really fast moving, and this is their features that stand out the most. They have this lateral line going down their back, and on either side of that line you have 3 rows of they're kind of like raised bumps with hairs coming off them. You can see that's 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows. So they're their distinguishing features. So this is what their damage looks like. They skeletonized plants, they're chewers. And this year we've seen, as I mentioned, the damage in lucerne and canola, forage brassicas, tillage radish, but they can also impact medic. And they are quite often seen first on broadleaf weeds. They have a really sort of seem to like quite a variety of broadleaf weeds. Goosefoot, heliotrope are two that have been mentioned recently. Also looking at the literature, there's records of them impacting lupins and also other summer crops like soybeans and maize. However, I'll just say that just because it's not listed here doesn't mean that they won't affect it as a species with not much known about them. Just be mindful that they could show up in other pulses as well, or other crops even. So management, they have had to be controlled this year in some circumstances. They have been in really quite high numbers. As I mentioned, they do love broadleaf weeds. So starting off with clean paddocks will definitely be an advantage. They quite often notice coming off the broadleaf weeds. If you do have to control them with chemicals, there are controls available. Just be mindful that weed web moth is not listed on labels. It's listed as its other name. As I mentioned, it's called cotton web spinner, and on the labels it's called web spinner caterpillar. There has been some commentary that these larvae are stubborn to kill, and we're not always, but sometimes. And we're really not sure what is behind this, but we have a few thoughts. So this species creates silk-lined burrows in the ground, and you can see that in this image here. You can see its head right there in the soil, and it's not like it burrows and then it stays there. It can actually come back up and then feed and then retreat. So they have a certain level of protection. I also mentioned that they create webs, and this would also often create a level of protection. You can see the larvae burrowing down there. There could also be a reinvasion effect. As I mentioned, they're quite often coming off broadleaf weeds and often in neighbouring pastures. So if a crop is sprayed, they could be re-entering the paddocks. And they might even have a high tolerance to insecticides. This wouldn't be the first case known in the insect world where a species does have just a higher natural tolerance to insecticides. So my best available advice at the moment when talking about chemical control is just don't cut the label rates and use high water rates to ensure good coverage. There's not too much known about what kind of natural enemies attack the weed web moth, but this was a video sent to me this year. You can see ants have been attacking the larvae. And I also found a recent study looking at the diet of bats. So they tested the feces, this is in northern New South Wales, they tested the feces of 7 bat species and found that weed web moth was present in 3/4 of the samples. So I thought that was a pretty cool fact to show that this species is an important dietary component for several species of bats. I just also want to point out there's another similar looking moth around at the moment, the cabbage centre grub, which is in the same family of moths, and it is also a web spinner. The species name is Halula hydralis, and it has been seen for the past month feeding on canola and forage brassicas, predominantly in southern and central New South Wales. So as I mentioned, it is also a web spinner. So it can be confused with the weed web moth in that respect. But looking at the larvae, they do look quite different. They're around the same size. However, the cabbage centre grub is more of a creamy colour and it has these rusty brown red stripes. They also differ in their feeding behaviour. I'd say cabbage centre grub behaves more like a borer. So it will bore into the growing parts of plants, of brassicas. And it can also tunnel through leaves, creating these large white blisters. You can see it there hiding between the leaf. And one key difference is that between cabbage centre grub and the weed web moth is that the cabbage centre grub is quite specific to brassicas. So if you're finding this webbing in, say, your lucerne, you can be more confident that it's going to be the weed web moth. So the cabbage centre grub moths have been noted around other areas apart from New South Wales. So they are around the southern cropping region at the moment. But with this pest, cabbage centre grub, we know that it is a warm season species. So we feel quite confident that its activity will decline and it shouldn't be an issue going into May and the cooler months. So that's the main difference with the weed web moth. The weed web moth is the one to look out for as we move into May and early June. I'll just finish off by saying if you need help this season with pests or insects and broadacre crops in general in South Australia and Victoria and Southern New South Wales, you can contact our PestFacts information services. We provide identification help. We provide the best available information on agriculture invertebrates, and we're continually releasing articles on invertebrate issues throughout the season, so you can subscribe to our mailing lists. So that's run by SARDI in South Australia and CSER in Victoria and Southern New South Wales. And what I'll do is I'll post the details on how to get in contact with us in the chat box. So that's all from me. What I'm going to do now is pass you over to Aaliyah Purtle to talk about Russian wheat aphid. Thanks for listening.
Hi everyone, my name is Aaliyah. Hopefully you can see my slides showing up now. I'm going to share with you some updates on a GRDC project that's led by SARDI with us as CSER as well, looking at the risk of Russian wheat aphid in Australian cereal crops, which has been on a lot of people's radar in the last couple of years. I'm going to start with our findings on how the Green Bridge affects Russian wheat aphid risk. And Martin will finish up with what we've learned about infestation risk and how we might manage using economic thresholds. So let's get into it. Now we all know about the Green Bridge, but for this talk, we are considering the Green Bridge not just as the summer weeds that connect across the summer, but I want to think about the whole connection from one season's crops to the next. And not just that, but also the users, i.e. the pests themselves, and what environmental conditions they need to successfully make each step from one year's mature crops across the bridge into the next year's emerging crops. Now, much of the Green Bridge effect is driven by weather, which we obviously can't control, so I'm going to talk about how we can manage the risk it creates. And with so many things, a lot of this comes down to monitoring, but monitoring can be very expensive, very time-consuming, and we want to be as targeted as possible. So we can ask what, specifically, and when should we be targeting? And for Russian wheat aphid, we can target their preferred weed hosts that are present around the time crops are most vulnerable. And for Russian wheat aphid, we know that's around crop emergence. Our project has done a lot of surveillance work, which I'll talk more about in a minute, but it's let us identify that the most highly preferred weed hosts for Australian Russian wheat aphid is very similar to what we see overseas. It's barley grass and brome grass, as you can see here. And preference for barley grass is just as high as you would see for cultivated wheat and barley, we find. It's really their favorite weed. Somewhat lower preference, we get weeds like phalaris and wild oats. Phalaris in particular can be a bit more important over the summer since it seems to stay green longer than some of the other preferred weeds. And we even get some native grasses depending on the region playing a small role. So this is really where you would want to be focusing monitoring efforts. It's also important to target beneficials when monitoring because these are users of the Green Bridge as well. And it's good to consider that if you get a lot of pests making it over a strong Green Bridge, it's likely you're getting their predators coming with them. And a good example of that was in an autumn 2019 survey where most regions we weren't finding many aphids. One of the few regions I did find aphids up towards Condobolin and Eugowra, there was already quite a high level of parasitism from these guys, these little parasitoid wasps. And you notice it when you're monitoring for them by these little mummies they leave behind. Also, we've been finding that ladybirds and their larvae and lacewings and their larvae are quite important predators of Russians. Now we can also prioritize monitoring based on region, and we want to monitor where it's going to be most important and cost effective, and that is climates where it is most suitable for Russian wheat aphid to persist across the Green Bridge. So how do we know if we're in a region like that? To answer this question, we started by conducting wide-scale surveys for Russian wheat aphid across the grain-growing regions. And here is what we found. These were extensive surveys from spring 2018 through to spring 2019. Starting out in spring 2018, we found a really wide distribution of Russian wheat aphid within the environment, in the weeds, and also in some of the edges of crops, especially where there's new growth around the edges. And all these little red points you see here, those are presences, and all of the green points are absences where we did not find Russian wheat aphid. When we went into the summer, there was already, this is now January here, a really dramatic decline in numbers. And you can see, especially in New South Wales and Northern Victoria, a lot of those sites where we had found Russians just a couple months prior already had nothing. That was driven by the really strong heat wave we got. There was just not a lot of green material for the aphids. And moving into the autumn, we found there was no recovery at all at that point. In fact, it was the opposite. Things had gotten even worse for the aphids, with only a few small populations still holding on around the Birchip region, up here towards Condobolin, and a couple spots here in South Australia. And we wanted to know what the effect that really strong decline had on recovery through to the next spring. So we did 2 more surveys over here in the spring. And while the numbers never got quite as big as they were the previous spring, the aphids were able to recover pretty much their entire range that they'd had the previous spring. So then we want to know what's going to happen in the next green bridge, this one that we're just coming off of. So we use this data to build a forecast, and essentially we're just relating presence of Russian wheat aphid to the environmental conditions where we found them, and that is specifically temperature and soil moisture conditions, and we use that relationship to predict into the future. And what we get is this map here. And this shows us the probability of finding Russian wheat aphid every month over the whole green bridge, October to April. So in this way, it's actually showing you where the green bridge refuges are predicted to be, where aphids are persisting. And you can see from this map overall that the probability is extremely low. If you look at that scale, we're talking about a less than 1% chance that we would find Russians every time we visited. And that is largely driven by what an extreme summer we had. But there are still regional differences. For example, you can see that the risk is somewhat higher over here around Western Victoria, and also up along this area in Eastern New South Wales. And part of that is driven by the fact that we did have some above average rainfall in those areas over the summer. And this is just an anomaly rainfall map from the BOM, where you can see green, corresponding to some of those regions of higher green bridge risk. And we can look at what this actually looked like on the ground. Here's Birchip in spring, summer, and autumn. And Cowra, both of those regions, we were still able to find green material on every visit. You can compare that to a spot like Hay out here in the really low risk area, where there was just nothing green at all in the summer. So we want to know, though, what else drives risk, and how well does this correspond to what we actually saw at the end of the green bridge in autumn. So this is the same map. I'm now just popping onto it the locations where we did find aphids in the autumn after the green bridge. And like I had said before, we had a little bit here around Birchip, up here towards Condobolin. And so you can see that it aligns relatively well to those refuge predictions, but it's not perfect. And part of that is because this prediction does not take into account local small-scale conditions, like whether a paddock's irrigated or what crops are grown. But because we did record this information when we went out surveying, we could still look at the effect it has. So for instance, we found that whether or not a paddock was irrigated bumps up the risk that we would find Russians persisting by 1.7-fold. All right, now for the fun part where we actually try and predict into the future. So this is the same map that you've been looking at. I've just changed the scale a bit because now we want to do a comparison. And just as a reminder, I've put up the rainfall anomaly map from the BOM, and I've also added the temperature anomaly map. So this just shows what extreme above average temperatures we experienced in that 2019 summer. And now let's compare it to this year's prediction. So you can see right away, there's some regions that are predicted to have higher green bridge risk this year, especially around this area and also Northern Victoria. And you can see that some of this is driven by the fact that we had milder than average temperatures in parts of the summer, as well as more higher than average rainfall. Now, this is a prediction, so obviously we want to know how the forecast holds up. Unfortunately, the data collection on this project ended in November, but SARDI has still been conducting regular surveys. They've had extremely low detections up until they had to stop this March. But this also is where reports from you folks will be really important, and it will help us determine how this forecast is doing, especially if you're in those regions where we're predicting higher risk. We'd love to hear your reports sent through to PestFacts. Now, the next question is, presuming you're in an area where aphids have persisted the green bridge and around for emerging crops, what's the risk they're going to get into those crops, and what's the risk it's actually going to cause a yield loss? And I'm going to hand over to Martin to answer those questions.
Thank you, Ilya. I'll try and share my screen. That should be working. Oh, there's a lot of chats coming up. Let me see if that works. That should be working for everyone. Okay, very nice artwork in your slides, Ilya. I can't do that. I'm not a designer. So I'll be talking a little bit about the work that we've been doing over the last 2 years to try and establish a threshold for Russian wheat aphids in crops. I do remember that a couple of years back in 2016, everybody was extremely afraid that it would do a lot of damage. And well, we're trying to see if that is the case. So what have we been doing? Why can't I go to the next slide? Doesn't seem to work. How do I do that? Oops, no, it's not doing what I want. There it is. Sorry for that. We've been doing trials in 2018 and 2019, as you can see, all over southeastern Australia. These are all in the area where Russian wheat aphid has been established already since 2017, as far as we know. And we've been doing 2 types of trials. We've done trials where we only did wait for natural infestation. So we just put in the seeds and we waited. But we also did quite a few trials in which we used artificial inoculation. So in a case where we had such a trial, we also had a natural inoculation trial, a natural infestation trial at the same spot. So it's a relatively simple experiment, even though it's a lot of work, and I have to thank everybody that has helped. You can see me here in Tasmania, where we've been setting up a trial. All the different people doing all the observations every 2 weeks, count aphids, count number of tillers with symptoms, and of course at the end we looked into the yield, quantity and quality. It's basically like an NVT style trial, but then you still have to do all the observations of the aphids. We used different commodities, wheat, durum wheat and barley. Untreated control, we used imidacloprid, so that was the aphid-free control as a comparison for yield loss. And we also tried to see if we controlled the aphids using chlorpyrifos at growth stage 40, if we would still have yield loss. Quickly to the results as far as the aphids of the natural infestation trials. So this is the 2 years and all the different spots. I hope you can recognize all the names of the places. I learned a lot about geography in this trial. Anyway, what you can see is that in almost all of these trials, there have been very, very few Russian wheat aphids popping up. Most of them are close to 0 or completely 0. There's a few very tiny little bars that you can hardly see on the screen, but there's a few big ones. Can we explain those big ones? Yes, in fact we can. Oh, I forgot to indicate on the left side, this is the number of Russian wheat aphids for 100 tillers. So in most cases, we stayed far, far below 0.1 aphid per tiller. So that's really a very low infestation. But we have a few cases where we saw aphids. So we can contribute them actually to the fact that we made some mistakes in the trials. Here in the 2 blue stars for birdship and griffith, we actually had spillover, so aphids from the inoculated trial going into the natural infestation trial. So that was clearly a problem in our methodology. We've solved that for this year, so it didn't pop up in 2019. And then we have the Ugora trial, which is a really weird trial, which we had difficulties in understanding. But in fact, it turned out that there was a very big green bridge next to that trial, which was a big paddock full of phalaris grass that was sprayed out basically at the time that this trial went in. And Ilya had already seen the aphids there. They just moved over to the trial, and that's how we got a heavy infestation. So Greenbridge is clearly a factor that needs to be taken into account. But all these other trials, there was basically no aphids popping up. So if you then look at yield effects, all we can do, of course, is compare untreated control with imidacloprid treated control. There's hardly any trials where we see a significant effect. The stars indicate that there is a significant effect between the two treatments. All the other trials, there might be a slight difference, but in most cases there weren't any aphids, so even if there would be a slight difference, you cannot really say that it was due to Russian wheat aphids. Might have been something else that was controlled with the imidacloprid seed treatment. In these trials, we have no clear evidence that there was yield loss attributed to Russian wheat aphids. Maybe in the one in Griffith and Loxton this year, there was a bit of an effect, usually because of a bit of cross-contamination. So basically, over the last 2 years, it seems that Russian wheat aphid did not cause any yield loss. So that's completely against what we expected. And we attribute that to the fact that the summers over those 2 years were so dry. There was very little grasses, very little Greenbridge. The few remaining grasses then had very low Russian wheat aphid populations. And if you look at the graph here, where you can see the extra sampling that we've been doing in South Australia only over the last, 18 months or something, you can see that basically over the, in spring, you get some aphids in October each year, but then it tapers off very clearly. And by the time it's sowing time, April, there's very few aphids. There was already very few aphids at the start of 2019. And in our case, for South Australia, for 2020, we have really difficulties finding any aphids at the moment. Even though it's raining right now here, just next behind me. So who knows, the grasses will start growing and maybe we'll get some aphids building up, but we're not expecting any risk for the crops this year. What if we have a wet summer? Would there be a higher risk of infestation? Probably a higher risk, yes, but if it's still very low, then there will not be any real damage. How do we actually test that? Well, there's only one choice, and that is doing trials with artificial inoculation. So what we've been doing is we've been putting in all those trials. We went there at growth stage 20, so very early. That's important for Russian wheat aphid. They need to get in early if they want to establish and develop in a crop. So growth stage 20, we sprinkled on the equivalent of 500,000 Russian wheat aphids per hectare, 50 per square meter. That's a quite extreme infestation rate. And we expected that that would give some huge population of aphids and potentially damage. So let's take a look at the results. Slow. For some reason, it's not responding to what I want. No. Why is my slide not moving? Sorry, guys. There we are. So these are the inoculated trials. We had 5 trials in 2018 and 9 trials that we managed to carry on to the end in 2019. And as you can see here on the left axis, we have very high populations of aphids. In the Griffith trial, we had 1,600 aphids on 100 tillers. That's quite a few aphids, and you can expect that there would be some damage. As you can see, the imidacloprid treatment in all cases was free or almost free of aphids. Not very surprising because imidacloprid does control Russian wheat aphid quite well. So that seems to be a successful strategy to keep the trial completely or almost completely aphid free. If we then look at what that will give as for the harvest in those trials, you can see that there's quite a few cases where we do have significant differences between the untreated control, so where the aphids developed, and the imidacloprid seed-treated parts of the trial. So yes, if you get high enough numbers of aphids, you can have damage. It's still important to also note that it's not always the case. Even with those extreme numbers of aphids that we put on at the very start, we still didn't get significant yield loss in quite a few trials. Mostly in those sites where the yields were a bit higher, there seems to be a very good resistance of the crop to the development of yield loss. that's satisfying. The question is, of course, can we develop this into a regional or an intervention threshold, and if possible, a regional intervention threshold, because it seems that the results are not the same in all regions. The concept of a threshold is relatively simple. You should not do a control if your control would cost you more than the potential yield loss that you have. So an economic threshold would be to spray only if the spraying cost is lower than your potential yield loss. The graph on the right gives you a bit of an indication that that depends from all kinds of factors, including, of course, the actual value of the harvest, of the yield. If the price of the cereal is very high, then you probably would have a lower threshold than if it would be very low. So we also have to think about what kind of units can we use for a threshold, because we, of course, tend to count individual aphids. That's a lot of work, so not easy to do. It's probably better to have a more simple approach. One thing would be to score tillers with symptoms, but that's not very reliable because even a lot of those tillers with symptoms don't have aphids on them anymore. So in the end, we will probably be going for the percentage of tillers with Russian wheat aphids on them, which means that in a field, you would have to check for tillers with symptoms and then look how many aphids are on those, how many of those tillers, sorry, have aphids on them, and then link that with the percentage of tillers with symptoms. We haven't finished this analysis. So far, it seems that the American thresholds are sufficiently conservative. There's very little risk of yield loss if you stay under those American thresholds. But we still need to work on this, and the analysis is ongoing. Not sure we'll have enough data to be very precise on a regional basis, but yeah, that's what we have done, what we can do at the moment. Of course, doing pesticide applications, there's other things that you have to think about. The risk of resistance development, the risk of killing of your natural enemies that Ilya showed, and possible other off-target effect of pesticides are all reasons to consider not just the economic kind of things, but also the other off-target effects of your pesticide application. Our conclusion for this year is there's very risk for any coming crop. The population of Russian wheat aphids are very low. There's certainly no need to do a prophylactic seed treatment. Many people might still do it or have done it already. It'll work, certainly, but it will work if there's no aphids, but then it's a waste of money. And it will still cause you a risk of maybe selecting for pests that develop a resistance to that pesticide. So if you can avoid prophylactic seed treatments, that's always preferred. At the same time, don't trust us completely. We are pretty confident that there will not be a need for a Russian wheat aphid treatment, but you're never sure about those scientists, including my opinion. So always observe your crop. Use the FIGHT principle, find the pest, identify it, quantify it, and if necessary, do a treatment. For Russian wheat aphid, that's actually quite easy. It's an aphid that causes very visible symptoms, and symptoms doesn't mean damage. It's symptoms, but that's not yield loss. If you can check those symptoms and see if they're Russian wheat aphid, then you can get good information. And if you go over the threshold, then you might do a treatment. From what we've seen in our trials, if you would do an intervention using, for example, chlorpyrifos, at your growth stage 32 spray, when most farmers would probably spray for broadleaf weeds and maybe a fungicide, you can easily do that, but only do that if the aphid is present in high numbers. Conclusion, well, basically this big hype that we had in 2016 about Russian wheat aphid being an enormous problem for cereals in Australia was maybe a bit exaggerated. It's not as big a pest as initially thought. It seems to have difficulties coping with our Australian dry summers. Green Bridge is not good enough for it. The question is then still, what would happen if we have a very wet summer, type 2016? That's something we don't know exactly. And unfortunately, we don't have the data yet, and we'll have to wait for a wet summer to have a better idea about that. The actual data we have on the trials cover only a couple of years, so ideally we'll need to get a bit more experience with Russian wheat aphids to be able to be more confident in defining regional thresholds. We also think that drought stress is a very risk increasing factor for Russian wheat aphid development in a crop, if it's in the crop. But yeah, we can't say that for Australian conditions yet because we don't have the data collected here. If you have Russian wheat aphid in the crop, basically it's very visible. That might be scary, but it's actually an advantage for your observations. It's easy to quantify the percentage of tillers with aphids. And if you would go over the threshold, which we think is quite unlikely this year, but if you would go over the threshold, you can still do a treatment before any yield loss would appear. I think that's the message for Russian wheat aphids. Let's give back to the next speaker, which would be Melina.
As you're probably aware, fall armyworm, or Spodoptera frugiperda, is a recent incursion in Australia, currently in northern Australia. And to date, the 23rd of April 2020, there are a number of detections in Queensland as well as in the Northern Territory and in Kununurra and Western Australia. So this map gives you a bit of an overview of detections to date. So there are a number of different icons. All of them indicate trap locations or locations where there are traps as well as crops where larvae have been detected. And that's what the different colours indicate. So the black icons indicate traps that are in situ but have not yet recorded any moths. The orange ones are locations where both moths and larvae have been detected, and then the blue ones are traps where there have been moths located but no larvae in crops, either because there are no crops or at this point there hasn't been an effort to try and find them. And the big question, I guess, particularly for the areas outside of this northern tropical and subtropical area where we expect to see fall armyworm relatively consistently is, what does that mean for us? How often are we going to see this pest appear in crops? And given that, you know, what we know about it from the northern hemisphere, particularly the US, where it migrates long distances in autumn, it would seem that potentially that may be the same pattern in Australia with migrations at the end of summer, which is sort of where we are now, and may well explain the moth detections that have sort of really ramped up in the last few weeks. So this map was generated by and published in 2018, and it's based on a Climex modelling that makes some suggestions about where fall armyworm, where the conditions are most suitable for fall armyworm across the world. And I thought it was useful to sort of compare the forecast for Australia with the model output for other regions. So these particular hotspots in Africa and in South America show that those regions that we're quite familiar with from the literature in terms of the devastation caused by fall armyworm appear to be much more suitable for fall armyworm than even the northern part of Australia. But the forecasting does suggest that there will be periods during the year, or in some years, where potentially we will see fall armyworm all the way down the east coast and in suitable areas of Western Australia. So it's a little bit unclear when those periods might be and what the conditions are that make them suitable, but there are some things about the biology of fall armyworm that we know from overseas that will inform that. So clearly years where there are available hosts and the conditions are warm. Exactly what will trigger the migration that causes these expansions of range is a bit unclear at this point. I just wanted to make the point that whilst the detections are across the north, any detections in the southern part of Australia, so New South Wales, ACT, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania, need to be made to biosecurity because it is still a notifiable pest in these regions until it is detected. So if you think you found fall armyworm, you need to make your make that known either by calling the exotic plant pest hotline or making contact with your local state biosecurity organisation. There are a number of grains biosecurity officers, which might be a good place to start if you know them, because they can help guide you through the process of notifying the correct people and providing either photographs that can be sent for identification and or live or dead preserved material. So it's very important for those areas where it hasn't yet been detected that this process is. So just on a fall armyworm, like many of the other Lepidoptera pests that we have in crops, it's a noctuid, so related to things like Helicoverpa and cluster caterpillar and so on. Many of those Spodoptera are tropical pests, although we do tend to see some of them occasionally in autumn. So Spodoptera exempta, for example, we see in winter crops, sometimes in winter cereals in autumn, and sometimes in faba beans in spring. So you may well already be quite familiar with Lepidopteran pests that are quite similar. But essentially, you know, it's much the same. The difference, I guess, with Spodoptera species is that they lay the eggs in clusters, and those clusters are covered with scales from the female's abdomen. And the larvae hatch en masse. They're nowhere near as cannibalistic as Helicoverpa is, so those larvae can feed in close proximity for some period of time before they disperse through the crop. And you can see that, you know, just like Helicoverpa, there are a number of instars. Again, the majority of the feeding and potential damage is done by these late instar larvae. Identification of Spodoptera frigiperta or fall armyworm is something that I think everyone is going to learn. There are a few resources that I think if you're in the field looking for fall armyworm are worth looking at. But here are some of the features that are key. In the early instars, they're quite hairy. As they get older, they lose some of that hairiness. And then there are some features in the sort of early instar larvae, like this little pink line that develops along the rear, and various other features, the spots and so on. The spots, to my mind, are not a particularly reliable feature because almost all the caterpillar pests that we deal with, and you know, a number of the non-pest species as well, have an abundance on them. It becomes a little bit easier, I think, with the late instar larvae because they become quite uniform in colour. This brown colour that you can see here seems to be pretty typical in late instar larvae. And the features, those very characteristic features with the spots, the arrangement of spots on the last two segments of the caterpillar, the rear end, are very characteristic. There are some additional features that you can look at in addition to the arrangement of those spots, so that are highlighted here. But I think it's a matter of, I guess, having in your mind what those key features are that you're going to look for and focusing in on them. So like Helicoverpa, there's quite a bit of colour variation, which makes it a bit more of a challenge, I guess, to distinguish it from other species. And this just illustrates some of that colour variation that this is a South African material from South Africa, but that adds to the complexity of determining which species you have, particularly if you have a population of mixed species. And one of the features that I mentioned was this hairiness of the early instar larvae. You can see that as they get bigger, that tends to disappear. They start to look quite greasy, a little bit more like a cutworm, but otherwise they are, in my opinion, quite similar to Helicoverpa. In terms of size, here's a size chart that shows that, in fact, very large Helicoverpa larvae are in fact a little bit bigger than fall armyworm larvae, but we have the same sort of pattern of growth where the larvae are quite small, don't do very much feeding in comparison with these last couple of instars or the last 3 instars where they're very voracious. And that's where that statement about crops disappearing overnight comes from. If you miss these early instar larvae and the signs that they're there in your crop, you may well find that the rate of feeding increases so dramatically that it does in fact look like your crop has disappeared overnight, even though good regular checking should ensure that that actually never happens. I have been in crops myself where there are a mix of Helicoverpa and common armyworm and fall armyworm, and my experience has been that before I had seen a lot of fall armyworm, that was a really difficult proposition. And this is a typical example of what you might see if you sweep a crop, a grass in this instance, and you pick up a range of larvae. So one of these larvae is, at least one, is fall armyworm, and I wonder whether you can, based on that quick flick through or what you might already know, if you can pick it. Well, that's it there, but you can see that it doesn't necessarily stand out. The agronomists have been pretty good at realising that they've got something different, but it tends to be more associated with the type of damage and the scale of the damage that they're seeing rather than the larvae themselves. So it will take some time and some experience before I think we're all confident to make those identifications. The moths clearly are another way to identify whether or not you have fall armyworm, and this is a lovely picture of a moth prepared for preservation with its wings spread out. This little pale patch on the forewing of the male is quite characteristic, as is this pale, largely pale hind wing with the brown margin. But Mark Schutz, who prepared these identification materials, has made a note here to say that other species may well have this. It's more likely that when you encounter a fall armyworm moth, particularly a male, it's going to look a little bit more like this. So this is a collection of moths that's come out of a pheromone trap. In this instance, they've clearly had a pretty rough time and haven't died very quickly, so the scales are knocked off, and that's a pretty challenging way to have to try and determine whether you have fall armyworm. And Mark Schutz in Biosecurity Queensland and his colleague Justin Bartlett are making that determination of suspect moths by dissection of the male genitalia. With better toxicants in those pheromone traps, we're finding that the moths are coming in very good condition, and the determination of whether there's fall armyworm can be made based on these characteristics. In the field, you're more likely to see the moths looking a bit like this. So these are two fall armyworm male moths in maize, and the female, which is quite different and a pretty nondescript noctuid. And just for comparison, for those of you who are familiar with Helicoverpa, here we are. So, more brown moths with a variation in the arrangement of the patterning and the dots and so on the wings. But the Spodoptera moths are quite different from Helicoverpa. For those of you who might be familiar with loopers, they're a lot more like looper moths, particularly in the coloration, than Helicoverpa. I think if you want to see the full presentation by Mark, who is doing many of the morphological identifications from the pheromone traps and other submitted samples for Queensland, he's got a presentation that you can view on YouTube. So what are we seeing in sorghum and maize? Well, we're seeing egg masses on the undersides of leaves, emerging larvae, first instar larvae, and very characteristic is this windowing. And in this case, this is Spodoptera lutura, cluster caterpillar, another Spodoptera species. And this is very similar, this sort of windowing between the leaf veins is very similar to the type of damage we would expect, or that we are now seeing with fall armyworm, and that we also see, if you can sort of scale that down to a winter cereal, see when we have Spodoptera exempta in crops. So that's one of the key things that I think you need to be looking for if you're at all concerned in a warm autumn, and particularly this autumn, I guess, as fall armyworm are here now. That's one of the key things that you need to be looking for on seedling winter cereals, is some evidence of that windowing. And that's just a close-up of those Spodoptera lutura larvae, and you can see how their windowing is lined up with those leaf veins. Once the larvae have emerged and started to feed, they balloon off, so they drop down on silken threads and they are blown by the wind. And that's why one of the things that we have seen quite clearly, particularly at low densities in maize and sorghum, is patches in the crop where there's just a few plants close by that have been infested by larvae that have clearly come from an egg mass somewhere in that little cluster. These are some of the photographs that have been kindly made available to us by agronomists in North Queensland, just so you can see in the field what they're seeing in maize in this instance. So again, early signs of fall armyworm activity with that windowing. The larvae, once they have reached sort of late second, third instar, have a very strong preference for establishing themselves in the whorl, and that feeding damage that they do in the whorl results in this sort of pattern of damage where they chew through the whorl. When the leaf unfurls, you end up with these shot holes. They can also sever that whorl, and when those leaves expand, they are completely truncated. The other thing that is a bit of a giveaway that you've got caterpillars in your crop is the presence of frass or poo. And it's very important that that's not the assumption's not made that it's fall armyworm, because there's a whole swag of Lepidoptera that can get into winter, well, not necessarily winter cereals, but into grasses. So fall armyworm is one of the, is now another that we add to the list, which includes common armyworm, Helicoverpa, and so on. So the other thing that you might see in a crop is fresh frass and active larvae. So this is a very small larvae, probably a second instar. You can see the sort of damage that it's doing on those leaves in the whorl, and a larger larvae that has done a lot more. One of the really encouraging things that we've seen in the field to date is natural enemy activity. There's been a bit of a question about what might adapt to use fall armyworm, given that we already have a number of noctuid species that are quite heavily parasitized and predated on by a whole range of natural enemies. So these samples were from a collection that we made in Mareeba in the Atherton Tablelands back in March. And you can see that there's a fungal pathogen. That's something that's probably more typical in the tropical environment. There are wasp parasitoids, and also parasitoids, fly parasitoids. The other things that we expect to be able to make a meal of fall armyworm are the things that we see every day on other noctuid caterpillars or other larval pests. So things like egg parasitoids, a very interesting question about whether something like Trichogramma and Telenomus, which are quite abundant in the environment, may make use of fall armyworm eggs. Ants, pirate bugs, earwigs, predatory bugs, spiders, lacewings, etc. The list goes on. So it'll be very exciting to see what actually attacks fall armyworm, but I think you can take some heart in that this is not going to be a pest that has zero natural enemies. From the very early stages of its infestation in Australia, we see some attack already. The other question I think that you probably have is, well, if we do get them in our crops, what can we do about them? Well, the availability of products for fall armyworm is currently governed by the availability of permits, and the place to go and have a look for permits is the APVMA portal. And this is the URL for that. It looks like this. You put in fall armyworm and up will come a list of permits. Back in March, when I did that search, there were 5 products registered, or under permit, I should say. When I look today, the 23rd of April, there are now 24 products. So it's worth having a look to see whether there are products available for you to use in whichever crop, if it comes to that. There are some really important things to consider when you're making decisions about fall armyworm in winter crops. The first is that it's a tropical and subtropical pest with an activity threshold of about 10 degrees Celsius. So 10 degrees Celsius seems to be the point at which it actually stops. The information suggests that it's not a species that can survive frost, so even if we were to see infestations in establishing cereals, it's unlikely that they will persist long enough to cause any long-term significant impact on those crops. And I guess under good growing conditions, we know that vegetative damage really has a very little impact on crop production and yield in particular. The other thing that's important is there are no thresholds for winter crops, which I think is reflective of the limited capacity for this pest to infest and cause significant yield loss in those crops. Existing seed treatments, so things that you might already have on the seed for wheat and barley, and perhaps some of the pulses may well have some control. Things like Cruiser and imidacloprid may have some incidental control sufficient to ensure that, you know, the seedlings aren't completely consumed. But that's something that I guess will be looked at some point, I think, to see whether to see what impact existing seed treatments may be having on fall armyworm. There's no local data available currently on the resistance that might have come with fall armyworm as a result of it being exposed to heavy insecticide use overseas. The best available information from CSIRO, who's done some work in Asia on this question, is that if the origin is Asia, and that seems most likely, then it's possible that there is resistance to organophosphates, for example chlorpyrifos, and to carbamates, for example methanol. There doesn't appear to be resistance to synthetic pyrethroids or some of the other products like Altacor. So I guess that will shake out in some time. GRDC has an investment with CSIRO to look at some of those questions, and that will be very useful information to guide chemical choice in future. But it's very important when we talk about chemical control to emphasise that the repeated widespread use of insecticides will contribute to the decline in natural enemy populations and also increase the risk of insecticide resistance, not only in fall armyworm but in other pests that are there in the crop as well. So in the northern region, we're quite concerned about the impact that increased treatment of crops that also host Helicoverpa armigera may have on the existing levels of resistance in that species. And there are probably a suite of things, including mites in southern Australia, where if there were need to spray fall armyworm in those early stages, you would also be incidentally exposing them to products. So, you know, the use of insecticides for fall armyworm needs to be considered quite carefully.